What's going on, my fellow makers? Matt from Keep Making, and today I'm going to show you how I combine 3D printing with a little bit of handcrafting to make a feudal Japanese tabletop village. Let's get to it.
Shall we begin?
So let's start with some of the STL files I'm using. So from the Asian Adventures Kickstarter by Lane Lovecraft, I'm going to use Rural House 1 and Rural House 2. These files are still available for purchase on Lane Lovecraft's site, so you can get them there. And I think they might even be purchased on my mini factory. So I print these out on my Ender 3, and then I'm just super gluing the pieces together. This one has a base platform, then the main floor of the house, and then the roof. I'm also using these wooden dowels I get from the dollar store, which you'll see a little bit later on. I'm using these to give it a little more height on the base. And I'm just gluing the bottom of the house to the base and then using some activator to seal it in place. And the third house we're using is from Village Hope Miniatures. This is Japan Rural House. Pretty cheap file. And it's pretty good, printed pretty easily. I did split the roof in half because I think I was running out of filament. The one thing about this file is that the tolerance on the connection pieces is very small. So they actually did snap off while I was trying to get the roof to attach to the bottom of the house. And so to combat that, I just used some magnets instead. Then I'm going to use the Wargame Farmhouse. This is on Thingiverse, and I'll provide a link in the description below. Very basic file. I actually don't print the roof, and I do scale it up 25% for the right scale. So instead of printing the roof that came with this file, I actually just used some cardstock and cut out some roofs. This is because I want this to fit more in the vibe of the previous pieces I'm printing. So I want them to have that thatched roof. And so instead of printing that one out, I just made these because this is going to be a lot quicker. Print like that would probably take 10 to 12 hours based off the shape. And this took 5 seconds. So a crucial detail for me was these beams at the top of the house above the thatch there. I really wanted to get something that emulated that, but I couldn't find a print for it, so I decided to make my own. So I went to Tinkercad. This is a free system you can use online. I use it to make a lot of basic shapes, stencils, stuff like that. So essentially all I did was I took 2 thin rectangles, turned them into an L, and then I did the same with a bunch of small cylinders, and I offset them a 1/2 inch each. So I just take a cylinder, make it very small, I take a rectangle, make it very thin, I duplicate those things and then cross them over. And so when it prints, it looks something like this. And then I can just glue this onto the top of my roof here. To give this farmhouse a little bit of extra detail, I'm just using a barbecue skewer from the dollar store, cutting it to the length, and then I'm going to glue it in between where those cylinders cross. So to simulate the thatch roof, I'm going to use some cocoa fiber. This is also from the dollar store. It's the stuff you put at the bottom of your plant pots. I just hold it onto the roof and then cut it to shape with some scissors, super glue it in place. If you don't want to get your fingers stuck together like I did while doing this, just make sure you use like a barbecue skewer or something to hold that in place while the super glue cures. Moving away from the buildings here for a second, I'm going to print off some of the Wargaming split rail fence. Very, very simple model. Essentially, this is just 5 rectangles. I print off a bunch of these, but I'm going to leave them for a while until we begin painting. So now moving on to the watchtower, very inspired by Princess Mononoke. I'm not sure where this actual one is, and then there's this Sarasa precision kit that I wanted, but I didn't want to wait for it to come. So I tried to find a file that I could print. This is the Japanese Feudal Watchtower work in progress, and just like the title suggests, it was a work in progress. I could not get these files to print for the life of me. I tried repairing them, I tried splitting them into different parts. I think the mesh is not complete, and I don't know enough about 3D printing to fix that. But the parts that I did need, I was able to print. So that base there with the square hole in it, then the sort of railing system there was all I really needed, and I could handcraft the rest of it. So I printed off another one of my roof rails, and then combining it with those 3 pieces there, I'm able to get a sort of base. And then I'm just using the same method I did on the farmhouses, which is the cardstock, to make the rest of the roof. The real secret here is these wooden square dowels. These are from the dollar store. Again, you could probably find them at a dollar store near you as well, or any sort of craft store. I glued these straight onto the base there, and that was perfect. That gave us our foundation. And then I'm just using the smaller ones, the same ones I used on the first house, and using my razor saw to cut them to shape. Then I'm just super gluing them in place. I do use a test model when I build things like this, just to make sure the heights are right, and so that models they could travel underneath there. So I wanted to offset the height. I thought it would make for some interesting playability, and so that's why I have that test model there. And I'm just pushing the legs together and then spraying the adhesive. If you want this to be precise, you should measure each distance between each leg, but I'm not really concerned with that. I didn't want it to just look like the beams were inside the legs. I wanted to make it look like they were sticking out on either side, like a hole had been drilled there, and then these were, friction fitted in place and then tied together. So I made a lot of these smaller beams, and these get glued to the outside of the leg. But before I glue them, I want to give them a little bit of a bevel just to add some visual interest. And so I went over to my sander and just gave them a little 45. And I just super glue everything on. Okay, now here is another hobby cheat code. All-purpose rope, cord, whatever. This is plastic twine from the dollar store. I think this was $1.50 for this case. I know a lot of people use real rope and real chain and stuff like that. For me, this was such a great solution. I'm able to take it, super glue it in place once, not have to super glue the whole thing, which I know some people have to do when you're using real stuff. I super glue it in place once, I wrap it around, I pull it tight, and then I leave a little bit of super glue to hold everything together, and then I move on to the next piece. The secret here is that I'm actually going to come back with a heat gun, and that means I can shrink everything that's a little bit too loose fitted, and if there's any sort of frayed ends, I can melt those back into the rest of it. Absolute game changer. Lastly, for the tower, I needed to make a ladder. So again, these are just 2 barbecue skewers from the dollar store. I'm going to take a 1/3 skewer and cut it into smaller pieces, about 1 inch across, and that way I can make rungs for the ladder. To hold everything together while I'm assembling it, I just use some spare XPS foam and skewer the skewers into them, and then I begin super gluing all the rungs in place. Let's go. Here's how the watchtower is looking when all of that's done. So the last structure I make here is with some, what do you call this, poster board or poster card, I can't remember. You get this at the dollar store for $1. I am just sort of roughly measuring things. I think I went a few inches across and 4 inches wide. And then I am just hot gluing this stuff together to make a sort of manger or I don't know, shed, shelter, barn type thing for these animals. So that's why they're off to the side here, just so I can make sure they fit. I cut 2 of the pieces at an angle, and then I slope the roof and give it a back here. Then to actually do the roof, I'm doing the same method I did on the tower and on both of the farmhouses. Then to give the side the wood paneling, I just use some popsicle sticks. I cut off the rounded edges and then I just super glue them in place. To give it that sort of alternating pattern, I just put one beam down, use another beam without gluing it to the surface to space out, and then I put another beam after that. Then I'll come back and cut a single beam in half and put the 2 halves in the middle. That sort of simulates that alternating pattern that buildings like this would have. Then I just use my razor saw to cut the overhang off. And just to give the roof a little bit of visual interest, I put a beam in the middle, cut it at an angle so that it sits flush with the rest of the building. So now moving on to the farmer's fields, or the gardens, or whatever you want to call them. I'm just using some MDF. I think this was actually the back of a photo frame that shattered. So I'm just repurposing that and cutting a bunch of squares or sort of rectangles to get the base shape we're going with. Then with those rough shapes, I just carve a bevel into them with a fresh Stanley knife. Make sure it's very sharp, or you could hurt yourself here. Then we're going to give our pieces a little bit of ground texture, and to do that we're just going to spread some PVA out all over these pieces and then go over with some tile grout, and that'll give us our sort of dirt ground formation. With the same spoon I used to spread the stuff, I'm just building up a little bit of texture here, and that'll be our, rows of crop and stuff. And so we need to now make sure all of this shape holds, and the best way to do that is to spray it down with some IPA. I'm using 50% IPA here. IPA helps because it works as a flow aid, so when you come to seal it with your watered down PVA glue, you want to make sure all of it's getting soaked, and IPA is the best way to sort of help that process move a little bit quicker and make sure everything is wet. If you don't do that, then you're going to end up with some pieces that start to fall apart. Then I come in with the burnt umber craft paint, very cheap paint again from the dollar store, and just go over everything. This is the same sort of brown I use on most of my terrain pieces. So to simulate the crops, I'm going to use my static grass applicator and some tufts. So I just run a bead of glue on all those formations I made, and then I'm going to use the static grass applicator to apply some static grass there, and that'll sort of simulate some rice or some, carrots, maybe something growing down there. I wanted to do some like cabbages too, so I'm just using a dotted glue on those formations, and then I'm putting clump foliage there. I start to use Aleene's tacky glue to do the other static grass ones because it's a little bit stronger, and then you get less sort of floppiness. Then I run a bead of glue on the outside, and this will just blend it into the rest of the battle sort of terrain I'm using. And then I go over it with some woodland scenics green grass, and then after that a sort of blend of a bunch of different fine flocks to just give it a little bit of more variance here. Just like the tile grout, the flock gets the same treatment of IPA and then sealant glue to make sure everything dries rigid and won't come apart. So we'll finally move on to painting the buildings now. So they all get primed with this dark red, and then they get base coated with this satin espresso. So you'll see me here priming with dark red. Then to paint the roofs and the thatching, I'm using this Vallejo wood, Model Air wood color, and all the pieces get this same treatment. So after the base coating is done, I'm going to give some highlights here, and to do that on the thatching, I'm going to use this beige color. This is another craft paint from the dollar store. I'm taking most of the paint off of my flat brush here and then rubbing it across the sort of higher surfaces of the model, and that brings out the details there. So the wooden elements get the same sort of technique used on them, and that's this cashmere tan, also applied through a dry brush. This is my favorite craft paint because this makes anything look like it used to be wood. So for the tower, which you'll see in a second, I base coated it just with that red primer, and then I hit it all over with this cashmere tan. It really sells the effect that this is a wooden thing that's been painting and weather is now chipping away that paint. The beams, which I glue in L sort of shapes to serve as corners, they're going to get this same wooden treatment too. And then I just do one more pass on the roof with the yellow ochre, just to give it a little bit more interest. And before we get into some weathering, I'm just going to go in with some model paints and get all the details. Okay, now moving on to the washes. I'm gonna use some oil washes, and to be honest, this is the first time I've ever tried oil washes. So I want to create something like a shadow in the recesses, and so for the wooden parts, I'm gonna mix brown with some black and thin it down to the consistency I need it. And then for the thatch parts, I'm going to mix the brown with a little bit of yellow ochre, and then use that on the thatch parts. After using the wash on the roofs, I wanted it a little bit darker, so I actually do go in a little bit later on with a brown wash, and then I think that does well to tie it in with the rest of the model, give it the same weathering effect, but it also keeps that yellow tone underneath. So I've had a bunch of dollar store farm animals laying around for a bunch of years. This is the perfect time to actually find an excuse to paint them. And you know, it's much cheaper than buying STLs or buying, you know, WizKids farm animals. So all you need to do is clean them up with a hobby knife and some sanding twigs, and then I prime them. And then, you know, I'm not trying to win any awards with these paint jobs. So after they get primed, you know, I give them basic animal paint jobs, and then to tie them all in and give them a little bit more realistic look, I just use a brown acrylic wash. And so now let's go to hear what Future Matt has to say about his process in doing this build.
Okay, just before the final reveal, I like to talk about things that went really well and then things that could have gone a little bit better, or things I would do differently if I was doing this again. So, the first thing I'll say is that I loved magnetizing that third house. I wish I had done that on all the houses, but it went really well, and I think it's something I will be doing if I make more FDM printed terrain. I plan to, but I'm running out of space, honestly, so that might be a while before we get there. But magnetizing those pieces so that I'm not trying to find where the holes line up exactly, especially the holes on the Asian Adventures terrain stuff. They're square. And you would think that them being square would leave for less, movement when they are actually together, but it doesn't. The first house only had one single joint, and it's jiggly anytime you lift it or anytime you move it. Jiggly's a weird word for that, anyways. And the ones that have multiple connection points, it's so hard to find them. It's next to impossible. I have to move that thing around so much. So I'm not a big fan of that. I would, if I was doing this again, magnetize them all. Let's move on to the oil washes. All in all, I love the way these look, but I wish I would have done an acrylic wash. With an acrylic wash, I think you have a little bit more control on where exactly you want your wash to settle. With an oil wash, it's going to get to those recesses because it's so thin and saturated. So oil washes are great for, doing washes, but when you have something like an FDM print that has so many layer lines, it's going to get in between every single layer line. And instead of you simulating, wear and tear between two shingles, you have two shingles that are completely covered in this wash. So part of the reason I had to do so many washes because I would do a wash, it would be so saturated all over the piece that I would have to go and tone it down with another wash and another wash until I got something I was pretty satisfied with. But all in all, I think if I was doing this again, I would stick to acrylic washes instead. And then the last thing is sealing the MDF. Obviously, I got a little bit of warping from spraying all the isopropyl and the watered down PVA on the garden pieces, which means the edges of them lift up a little bit from the board, and it's not the best. It's not a big deal. I don't think it really affects gameplay at all, but it doesn't look as nice as it possibly could. And if I was doing these pieces as commission pieces, they would definitely not look that way. My monitor's shutting off in the background. Anyways, that's a good sign that we should move on to the final reveal. So without any further ado, the Feudal Japanese Tabletop Village.
Shall we begin?
So there it is, the Feudal Japanese Tabletop Village. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel. Make sure you like this video. Hey, like the video. I really thank you guys for your support. I love to hear from you guys in the comments. I've had some really great interactions with people who are tackling similar projects, so it's really cool to see how we're doing things differently. Make sure you're following me on Instagram. I post a lot of my works in progress on there. A lot of the minis I paint that aren't full videos for this channel, they end up on there. I like to keep this channel for like the bigger projects I'm working on, but if you'd like to see me paint more minis, let me know and I'll definitely do that. Yeah, it was really fun to work on this project, and I'm really excited to put it out there and see what you guys think about it. Yeah, I hope you got something out of this video watching this video, but if not, I hope, at least you're inspired to keep making. See you later, guys.